Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Cyber Edge. I am Drew Fearson, your host, and with us today is the man, the myth, the legend, Joe Silva. Welcome, Joe.
Hey, Drew, thanks for having me on. It's good to see
Hey,
you again.
good to see you as well again, too. So, everyone starts with an intro, so we want to give Joe a little introduction. Currently, he is the CEO of Spection, which is a startup that he founded that focuses on securing the software supply chain. Prior to that, Joe had held leadership roles at large enterprises on the cyber side, like JLL, as well as was the SVP of cyber at TransUnion. Prior to that, held threat intel leadership roles at iSight as well as Symantec. And then prior to that, came from a background in supporting the government, both the Air Force and the Treasury. Uh, does that about sum it up?
Yeah, I was also in the Army. I just think it's probably not on my LinkedIn.
It's not, but now we know. That's
No.
good. How long were you in the Army for?
uh, about 7 years.
Nice, very cool. Well, thanks for coming on. I wanted to have you on for a couple reasons. We've obviously known each other for a while, but I think that your journey is pretty unique in today's landscape. Whereas you came from security, most recently was the CISO at a pretty well-known place, but then identified a set of problems that weren't being addressed in the marketplace and decided to take the plunge. So I want to unpack kind of what your thought process was there, some tips and insights that you might have just from going along your journey, whether it's thinking about who to raise from, how to raise, who your co-founder should be, just all that type of stuff that might be interesting for someone that's going down the similar path. And then from there, we'll go into some more macro types of scenarios around AI and cyber and how it's affecting um, the line that you're working in and all that type of stuff.
Sounds good. I'm not sure I'm yet qualified to say how to successfully start a startup, but yeah, happy to offer my take on it.
Right? That's what people want to hear, right?
Mhm.
What's the
Yeah.
good, the bad, and the
Mhm.
indifferent, right?
Yeah.
So, well, I guess first off, let's go with the easy softball question, right? What made you decide to go the startup route?
Uh, you know, I had a great job, right? I worked with a great team. JLL as the CISO there. Enjoyed what I was doing. And there's probably I had had ideas about problems that weren't being solved for a while, right? And I had worked with a lot of startups, advising them, trying to help them solve some of these problems in a way that I thought would address big needs in the market. I saw a need, obviously, around how software was assessed and secured that I didn't think. One, I didn't think it was being done well or cohesively, and two, I thought that with like the advent of an increasing amount of software being generated by AI, that it was only going to get worse and was probably going to break the ecosystem around current practices. But when I think about what I like to do, right, I like to lead, right? What kind of energizes me? Leading, building, and winning, right? I don't think that's probably that unique. I had a great opportunity to lead and work with other great leaders in previous roles, TransUnion. I worked for a great guy, Jasper Osenchuk, CISO there, learned a tremendous amount from him. Worked with some tremendous technology executives at JLL. Uh, building, I only get hired to like build out functions, teams, overhauls. Nobody brings in Joe Silva to make the trains run on time. Probably because I have a reputation for breaking things and then rebuilding them. But winning is hard running an enterprise security program, right? There's a lot of different definitions of what winning looks like. I mean, the core competency of a CISO at a Fortune 200 company is, at least one of them is being able to master the executive politics of that company. And I'm not sure what, winning looks like something different in every context. Sometimes it just means not losing too bad, right? Sometimes it means just keeping the organization informed and keeping them operating per their risk appetite. Um, but winning in a definitive way where you can say, hey, we saw a problem, we solved a problem. Uh, and us winning helped other people, is helping other people win. That was a feeling that was really hard to get
Mhm.
as CISO at JLL. So my co-founders and I, we'd worked together for, going back 10 years. Josh Scourge, Julian Maladry, both, great people and brilliant engineers and offensive security professionals. Right? They had all the technical acumen I lacked. And we were talking a lot about this problem around how is software assessed? Where is the CVE ecosystem around vulnerabilities just not sufficient to enable proactive management around software risk and vulnerabilities? And then what could be done about it? From a practical perspective, vulnerability management is it's a tough topic for a lot of security executives. I would say it's probably the number one political capital killer I dealt with, where I'm just continuously, peppering my colleagues in technology with information about how they're not doing enough to keep pace with patching, even when they're operating, fully at capacity. I'm prioritizing within my organization as much as possible around what I give them. But it's that prioritization is only as good as the data on hand. They're doing the best they can to balance stability, feature delivery, and security on their end. Uh, and I felt like there had to be a better way, right? I looked at how we were doing things with regards to Intel feeds, trying to prioritize things within the context of our organization, and then I looked at a whole suite of software that I saw, whether it was homegrown solutions or just things that were obscure, that were like obviously insecure but didn't have CVEs. And I felt like there had to be a better way to figure out, how do we evaluate the inherent security of software, understand what it means to an organization in a risk context, and then mitigate that risk, right? And how can I report on that? Uh, Provide a good view of whether it's, commercial software, what is our third party software risk? I've been bitten by that a couple of times in some public incidents, um, but also open source solutions and the increasing amount of homegrown software I was seeing built. So I decided, there's got to be a better way. I wanted to make sure that this was like a problem that I wasn't uniquely experiencing. Talked to a lot of my peers, Josh and Julian and I thought about what we could do. We thought about some analogs in other parts of security. You know, I thought about antivirus, and how we were kind of handling like threats and malware. And I had the opinion that like vulnerability management was kind of stuck in the antivirus era. Um, it hadn't even gone to the next gen AV and the EDR era, right?
It's interesting because you haven't. It's not this, like you said, it's not the sexy topic of the day.
Right.
It's kind of been there forever, and it just is what it is. So it's an interesting take. Walk me through what that process looked like when you had an idea, you wanted to validate it, right?
Right.
Would you go to your friends and say, "Hey, I have this idea. Does this make sense?" Or was it more of a formalized structure? How did that all work?
No, it was very informal initially. Hey, would a more runtime approach to like software vulnerability management make sense if it provided you with the ability to passively assess software at scale, better prioritize patch management, but also provide insights into things that could be mitigated regardless of whether or not that was a patch, right? Like, did you have that level of understanding, right? I mean, like visibility for anything new, visibility is necessary but not sufficient, right? I think there was a time when people were buying products that only gave visibility. I don't think that's enough, right? Nobody in security just needs more problems pointed out to them. But if you had this visibility into all software at runtime and could understand the inherent security of it specific to your environment and then could mitigate it, it could give you solutions, whether they're IT hardening solutions or integrations, whether it's security tools like STIMs, EDRs, XDRs, uh, would that be valuable context and like not just give you a better way to do vulnerability management, but honestly increase the efficacy of what you're doing, because like help is not on the way, right? Like vulnerability management teams just can't keep getting bigger to the scale of the problem. I've heard vulnerability management called the widowmaker of security
Ooh.
jobs. Yeah, I walked into TransUnion, and I think the first week there, I met the gentleman that was managing vulnerability management at the time, who actually ended up taking another job. And he was like, "Yeah, this is the widowmaker. This job, that's what they call it. It's kind of like the drummer in Spinal Tap." Um, so,
Us
so
old ones
I
will get that, others won't.
yeah, sorry about that. Look it up. Um, but I I just looked around and I was like, everybody just accepts that this sucks, right? I saw all sorts of things that were just dead wrong about how we were managing the problem. I mean, unauthorized software installs is always going to be a problem, right? IT governance is always going to be, far from perfect. But even within like software approval processes, you know, third party risk, supported by vulnerability management was just getting peppered with new requests to install softwares on laptops, on servers, from various teams that had a business use or felt like they had a compelling need. And you just can't evaluate that at scale, right? You can't do a deep technical evaluation. I mean, if you look at a piece of software, I don't want to pick on a company, but I mean, just well, you look at like some of the Citrix products, right, which have been tied, to a lot of public security incidents due to vulnerabilities in them. Does anybody really think when you're running the most up-to-date version of like Citrix Workspace that it's really secure, or do you just think that a vulnerability hasn't been found yet, right? Not to pick on Citrix, I'm sure this is true for other products as well. So you just can't do that evaluation at scale. And so what ended up happening? People are using vendor rating sites as a proxy for the security to say, okay, well, we're going to allow in a solution from this company. Here's their score on whatever service we're using here. Okay, that's the only thing we can do to be able to support like the velocity of software requests. Every once in a while, if it was maybe going to be used for something really critical, maybe the red team would engage on it. And Josh led my red team at TransUnion, you know, like senior offensive security professionals that can really evaluate software comprehensively like that at runtime. That's a high demand, low density resource, not going to scale across a whole bunch of requests. So I didn't like that. And then I just didn't like waiting for the next fire drill every time there was like a critical CVE and trying to figure out all the context around it. Um, Even people who were really buttoned up, friends of mine at very well governed large global financial services organizations, they're struggling with this. They're struggling for how they come up with criteria around security exceptions for things that just can't be patched per policy. And then probably most frustrating to me was my vulnerability management team is doing all this information to try to synthesize vulnerability information, bring in external intelligence feeds, try to get as much inventory-based intelligence as possible, which is tough because I know very few organizations that have good software inventories, especially around the context of how software is used. But then they weren't able to deliver enough actionable insights to my blue team, right? So from a threat detection standpoint, they could say, hey, this is here. We've got a WAF rule that we think should protect against it. Or, hey, this is running here. We're not sure we'll detect the exploitation at the endpoint, but we're pretty confident at the second stage our EDR will catch it, something to that effect, right? But I couldn't say, hey, what are my 20 riskiest pieces of software and what can I do within my sphere of control owning a security program to mitigate that risk? Because I have to let the business operate too, right? I can't just say, hey, sorry, software's insecure, can't use it. Or, hey, sorry, you're going to have to spend all your time patching. And if that creates stability problems, then so be it, right? I mean, IT capacity for this, of course, everyone can get incrementally better. But, over the span of a few years, it's fairly fixed, right? So something's got to give. There's got to be a new solution. Talked with my co-founders, recognized there was an opportunity to maybe leverage runtime data,
Hmm.
which seems like is what we're doing in every other security context. We're leveraging runtime data to be more proactive, more actionable, more timely around software, especially homegrown software that people maybe don't even know what it does, right? Somebody in an operations function like creates some tool to do some bespoke function for them in HR or finance. Uh, so there's no secure SDLC. But to see what that software is doing, uh, figure out what the risks are, triage it, mitigate it, and then do that in like a single product, right? Like not have different site pictures across, your third-party risk team, security architecture, vuln management, threat management. So we talked a lot about that. I shared that with probably, I don't know, 40, 50 folks in the industry, um, some of whom, when we did our seed round, actually invested. Um, and yeah, took the plunge, right? So I said I would stay at JLL for at least 3 years because I figured it was like a 3-year project. I made it, 2 years, 10 months. But left them in like tremendously good hands. They were probably ready for the next step, and the program's going to keep growing there. So I felt good about leaving, and yeah, so since July, full time as CEO of Spection, working with like some great early customers and design partners. Uh, I learned a lot more about the problem than I thought I knew when we went into it. I'll say that.
Nice. So you interview 50 plus people, or you talk to them informally, right? You get
Yeah,
validation, you start to frame, all right, here's the problem, here's the potential solution. And then at that point, does it go to your co-founders and they just start building?
yeah, yeah.
And it's
Well,
different cycles of iteration with the design partners?
yeah.
How does that look?
It's also like, would you pay for it, right? Would you
Mhm.
pay for this? Because whenever you're a new solution, if you're doing something really new, you're maybe solving an existing problem a different way, and it's not always clear what you replace, right?
Mhm.
And like I think the era of massive security budget growth is over I think in the near term. So it's what do you replace, and if you're not replacing something immediately, right? You're an early company, right? You've got to work with design partners. You're going to build. People are going to figure out kind of what you best replace versus what you complement. So then, in that context, what would you pay, right? Um, yeah. Then, talk with my co-founders. We talked about different aspects of the problem. We talked at the very high end, right? Like the boutique problem of software supply chain attacks, right? Where very mature organizations they're able to actually focus time and resources on that effort. And that was where we started. How do we use runtime insights to detect potential supply chain attacks? But then, I talked to, probably another 20 folks who said, hey, that's really interesting, but like, I don't have the luxury of just worrying about supply chain attacks, right? I just have to like, I'm in the coal mines every day working on vulnerability management. I need a way to get ahead of this problem. That early on, I don't think we appreciated the amount of software sprawl, especially from internally developed applications that were just happening outside IT organizations.
Interesting. Even coming from the background that you had, I mean, those are two large shops that probably bought a lot of different security products, but it's more widespread than you thought.
I would say it's the amount of just tools that are built by teams.
Hmm.
But, I mean, I think you become conditioned in security to just assume everything's a dumpster fire, right? I mean, right? You take a job as the chief digital janitor, you expect to be just cleaning up messes all the time. But the amount of software that is developed within organizations, I wouldn't even say like shadow IT from a procurement perspective, just being built within organizations, oftentimes outside of IT. So whatever technology and governance exists ends up not even applying there and being used to support operational functions way more than we imagined, right? I
Well,
kind of had a sense of this because I saw this with RPAs where you would see very enterprising uh like young analysts in finance and HR. They're always trying to automate so they can do more. Sometimes you see things like loose handling of credentials and data in some of these RPAs. But now people can just write their own code.
interesting point, and they don't necessarily have that kind of security background. When you were originally talking about that, I was thinking it from that lens with just like, well, hackers are going to hack,
Yeah.
right? That's what's going to happen. But if you get the finance and business side, people that can just go into, you know, whatever and start talking about what type of application they want built to automate, and it just does it, that's a whole separate slew of issues.
And the problem varies in severity, from organization to organization, depending on how locked down systems are. But the amount of large global companies that have very permissive installation policies is rampant, right? Everybody's got an initiative. Everybody who's got it, a lot of local admin, everybody's got an initiative to clean it up, right? That is just kind of like the big dig in Boston, right? That just goes on forever, right?
Why don't they get to it? Just because of the amount of sprawl and the different
It's
types of
the amount.
third-party software that's there?
It's the amount of sprawl. There's always a need. It's very difficult to tell people no. Um, and they always find more. Comes in through M&As. And it's not just on workstations, right? It's also on servers. You know, Engineering teams need to be agile, so they need to install the tools that they feel like they need to do their jobs, right? And so sometimes you see it in development and test environments, but the next thing you know, it's making its way into production environments, right? Or there's a loose barrier between those environments. It's an endemic problem because you know everybody's trying their best and trying to move fast, and convenience versus security. Uh, convenience is generally going to win.
True story. So let me ask you this: how did you find your first set of design partners? What did that process look like?
It was folks that I already knew who absolutely said they would pay to get this problem solved, right? And but also folks that I knew who would have really good feedback, right? So folks who were friends of mine, but also could tell me like, "Hey, Joe, you're way off course here," or "Hey, I know you're well intentioned, but this really sucks," right? So it's got to be those types of friends. And luckily, I have a lot of friends who are willing to tell me I suck.
Not once to sugarcoat it. That's good. What when you got into it with in the weeds with those design partners and you were iterating, what was one of the big aha moments or surprises that you weren't expecting to see as it related to Spection?
So for us, because what we do is, we detect all the software um, running to include things like portable applications, right? Things that don't typically get installed. But what I was seeing was the heterogeneity of software ecosystems was one. Just, at some point, you start expecting, as you get deployed more and more throughout an environment, you're going to say, okay, kind of the amount of software we're going to see is going to slow. Not so much. Um, right. And this is, at organizations that have mature security programs and like strong IT leadership programs, right? Like these are not yahoos, right? Everybody inherits something, right?
Yep.
But the other thing was just the amount of like inherently insecure behavior in software and just the amount of permissive access that software is being granted by default. The amount of software we were seeing that runs at a level of privilege beyond what should be necessary for what the software does, uh, sky high. The amount of software we were seeing that's accessing like all credentials. And
Is that a default setting that comes with it, or is that someone
I,
set
I,
it
I
up and
you
was
know,
just
I,
using it?
I think it's Mm. It's a function of saying, hey, the easiest way for us to deliver functionality is just to have access to everything, right? Within software. But again, that's the kind of thing you're only going to see at runtime typically. Um, Certificate management, awful. The amount of software that is accepting revoked certificates, right? Like certificate
Really?
that shocked me. But again, it's because everybody is defaulting to just don't break, allow every connection, right? Um, and the amount of software that is like executing like command shells and PowerShell. Uh, so I wasn't prepared necessarily to see all of that in software behavior. Um, but also I would say the amount of software you see where, if I was in one of my previous roles and we're looking at buying some software, especially from a startup, that's actually that behaves pretty well, right? That doesn't show a lot of insecure behavior, right? Like you see a lot where can, the ability to say yes is also really important, right? There's a lot of just, oh, you're a startup, a lot of concerns about like your secure SDLC practices. But we saw a lot of software from smaller companies that was actually, used extensively, but not displaying a lot of insecure behavior. So some of that actually surprised me as well.
Interesting. So, did you find it because it was an interesting time when you started this, right? Security
Yeah.
budgets were the purse strings were a little bit tight,
Yeah.
right? And there's that kind of movement to have one large vendor that did it all, one throat to choke, all that type
Yep.
of thing, right? How did you kind of circumvent around that? Was it the fact that you solved a problem that wasn't being solved, or relationships, or How
I
did
mean,
you beat that?
part of it's relationships, right? I'm very fortunate to have some very strong relationships with folks who, really willing to help out. But also, yeah, I mean, I think the industry just kind of, vacillates between platformization, right, and then a really diverse ecosystem of innovative solutions. And I think you're right, right? We were entering into like what everybody felt was a platformization period. Even, maybe like the venture community was a little tighter, but Uh, I think it's easy to be outside of the platformization, rubric if you're doing something that nobody else is doing and is going to be able to easily deliver, right? Like, listen, this is my experience in cybersecurity is if anybody's doing something innovative in 3 years, whatever they were doing is a commodity, right? That's just
True
now
story.
you can keep building upon that innovation, right, and doing more. But if you think that what you're doing today is going to carry the day in 3 years, you're wrong. Um, so it's, solving a niche problem. I mean, that none of the other platforms can just solve in an extensible way, right? That's kind of what we saw. I mean, the largest security companies, right? The CrowdStrikes, the Palos of the world, they've got, I mean, from the perspective, functionally unlimited R&D money, a lot of brilliant people, but they've also got a lot of equities that they've got to manage, right? So they can practically, they can theoretically do anything, but it's maybe not practical for them to be able to solve this problem. There's also no shortage of really brilliant engineers, right? Out there, both in the US and certainly, all over the world, right? I think I see like a new group of 8,200 veterans starting a company every day, right, and raising a record amount. Um, but everybody's got smart people. That's to say, right? Even like smart people is somewhat of a commodity in this space. But where I felt like we had an advantage was as practitioners actually understanding practical pain points and how things need to fit into business processes. It's not enough to just say, hey, we're going to do something really innovative, and then CISO or security leader, you go ahead and change all of your internal business processes so that you can leverage this innovative product. That's not enough. You've got to fit into their business processes, right? And that's tough because initially, when you kind of just release a beta, you're not going to be able to do that, right? You're like, hey, here's what's unique. Is this interesting? And then so much of the design partner relationship is saying, hey, how can I link this into your business processes in a way that makes them better, right? And like organically morphs them to be more productive.
Gotcha. So just kind of going with the flow with it.
Yeah.
You mentioned smart people, and they're becoming a commodity, and that's only increasing, right, with the rise of AI, whether it's
Yeah.
Copilot or agentic
Yeah.
types of tools. How has that, in your mind, impacted the space that you're playing in, and what new challenges are coming down the pipe that you're going to have to be able to solve for?
I mean, there's the promise of AI generated code is like we ourselves are a software company,
Mhm.
right? I would say that for what we're doing, Um, you know, AI is like helpful for some data enrichment stuff like that. Um, you know, it's not quite at the point where it can write a lot of the code that we need. But in terms of the attack surface created by AI generated code, I mean, I think there's a lot of issues to be solved there, right? I saw a stat with like I think there's like 40,000 CVEs released last year, right? It was up like 30% or something. Like nobody thinks that that's actually representative of all of the flaws in software available, right? Like everybody knows it's a best effort, like just pretty heroic effort across the security research community. Um, like that was where I felt like the urgency and we were hitting an inflection point with the amount of AI generated software. You know, I've worked at companies that have delivered software, right? And there can be like a very cynical perspective, like, oh, developers, are always going to be make mistakes, or always going to cut corners, never going to fix things. But in general, I think what we've been seeing is there's never been a greater focus on application security, right? I don't think we've ever seen like developers take security more seriously. Almost every group of developers I've met is well intentioned with regards to security and takes it seriously, right? I mean, achieve perfect results, right? I mean, I think the vulnerability stats prove that out. But they do the best they can, right? And they're only getting better. There's only been more and more emphasis on AppSec. Uh, I just don't understand how with AI generated code, and unless we have AI AppSec that is commensurate with the amount of AI generated code and that we have high confidence in, how we don't start to slip back, right? I mean, the best application security analysts I ever worked with started as developers,
Yep.
right? So there's going to be less developers, right? There's a whole bunch of anecdotes, right? I think, Salesforce, I think Netflix also talks about how they are going to be cutting back on hiring to rely on AI. But, what I look at is AI can write your code. Can AI threat model your code? I mean, like, if we don't have, I don't know how people can effectively threat model code that they didn't write. Um, And so I think we're actually going to see backsliding in terms of the amount of application security
Interesting.
in
Yep.
in software. Now it may catch up, right? But typically innovation always outpaces security, then security kind of catches up to a certain extent. So there's the combination of that where I think the attack surface is going to expand in a way that kind of breaks the ecosystem for around how we understand vulnerabilities in software. And there's CVEs, there's a lot of like really good efforts that are kind of based on that to analyze it, predictive scoring around exploitation. But ultimately, I think that ecosystem is going to be broken. And then on the other end, I think it's just like always axiomatic in security that like bad guys always outpace the good guys, right? They've just got a faster SDLC. They can execute the OODA loop a lot faster than good guys. And so I don't know why that's not going to be true in AI, right? So you say, okay, we've got an increasing software attack surface embedded by AI generated code. And then we've got AI aided attackers who are going to be looking to exploit that.
It's fascinating
So,
for sure.
yeah, I mean, I think it's scary because I think we had just started to really instantiate a culture in enterprise developers around security and taking it serious. So where I can say, in the last, you know, 8 years, I had seen in general, just developers really hold themselves more accountable, even if an organization wasn't, just saw engineers hold themselves much more accountable for security. And I don't know how we're going to maintain that momentum with AI generated code.
Very valid point. Switching gears a little bit, if you were talking to yourself right before you started this, and you're going to give yourself any piece of advice about how this journey's gone so far, something that was unexpected, kind of like we talked about at the beginning, or an aha moment type of thing, what would you tell yourself?
I mean, I don't think it's an aha moment, right? Maybe I'm doing something wrong because I haven't had a real aha moment, but you know, it's not enough to just work with really smart, motivated people, right? People who just work really hard. Like you have to work with really good people early on. Like these have to be people who are really good and really have an appetite for candor internally, right? Um, because obviously there's a lot of struggle. There's a lot of zigzagging. You're being reactive to all sorts of different forces early on. Um, so what I probably didn't appreciate the importance of, but I'm fortunate that I do, is work with really good people early. That's, I would say, I mean, being a good person is obviously not enough. There's a lot of other competencies you got to bring to the table, but it's very difficult unless everything goes right and everything is up and to the right for you from day one to do something hard like this without having really good people. And also, uh, you know, I what I recognize is it's really easy for me to say, hey, this was my experience. This is how I think about problems when I was running security programs, right? You can't just mirror image to everybody and think everybody thinks about it that way, right? There's a range of different schools of thought around how like leaders like to run their security programs, what they prioritize. Um, work with somebody where they think about their security program in terms of insurability, right? And that's kind of how they look at it. Like they almost take like an actuarial viewpoint on on their security risk.
Yep.
Um, there's a lot of folks, a lot of practitioners who start a company. They do it because they want to find a better way, and they're really passionate, right? I think one of the reasons, like I got into cybersecurity, leaving the government, was the mission focus. that you find in this career field, right? And it's probably the thing I love about it the most is the mission focus of the people, right? But they're zealots, and everyone you're working with is not a zealot, right? Sometimes they care about efficiency more than they care about effectiveness, right?
Yep.
And so in being able to modulate, and understand, how to solve that problem, or being really candid and saying, like, I can't solve every problem, right? Say, hey, I can just solve this problem. Sometimes you got to be able to tell somebody, like, hey, understand what you're trying to do here. Here's how I would do it. This is not necessarily inspection is not necessarily the best way to solve that problem.
Gotcha. Was there any speed bumps that you guys encountered early on where you had
Oh
to?
yeah, I mean, scalability, right? So, I mean, good problem to have, but we saw some, like, early design partners, they want to do much larger implementations.
Mhm.
Um, so you're constantly learning on the fly. I mean, like the core competency of an engineering organization that, my CTO, Josh, is like really the master of is, you know, how to design the plane, build the plane, and fly the plane at the same time over and over again, right? So yeah, scalability from a technology perspective was probably the biggest one, where we had all these features we wanted to roll out. We understood the inherent, value that we could bring based on all this runtime analysis. But then it was like, okay, guys, got to pause on that because we've got to build out to scale, which is great because we get a lot of interesting data. Um, but then on the other side, it's just, even like the sales cycle, managing sales cycles is, it's tough, right? So it doesn't matter, like, having friends doesn't really matter, right? As a matter of fact, it's harder because you have to like protect, you have to go above and beyond to disinvolve your friends from any sales cycle, right? Um, so you're working with these procurement teams. Sometimes it's even more of a process because your friends can't be involved, right? They're recused or whatever.
And you want them to be because you just want to pick up the phone and be like, just fix it, right?
I do, but I don't, because I've been in that position, so I don't even want to
Fair.
put them in that position. And honestly, like I said, I like winning, right? That's one of the reasons that we're doing this, and I like winning on the merits. Um,
Makes sense.
yeah.
Absolutely. So one of the other things that's been newer for you, going into this type of role, is having to fundraise and going
Yeah.
to out to different VCs and what have you. How's that experience been for you, and what have you learned from it?
Uh, fortunate, fortunate to work with some really good venture firms, right? But it's, they're looking, they're taking bets, right? So if they're going to invest in 20 companies, they know not all 20 are going to be tremendous winners, right? And they're really betting on big upside. And I would say, probably from having been a security practitioner and trying to be so practical and tempered in my mindset, like in the back of my mind to myself and with my co-founders, we see the big opportunity, right? But we were reticent to be like too like overblown about like how game changing it could be, right? In our minds, we knew it, but we're very practical, right?
Yep.
And sometimes you can undersell the opportunity early on. That was something that we learned,
Interesting.
right?
Okay.
Right? Like, I try to be very practical, very measured. When people come in, and they make bombastic claims about the potential for something, sometimes you don't take them seriously. And obviously, with the venture community, you have to back it up, right? You have to paint the picture. But if you don't come in with the vision of how this can be a huge win for them, right? If this is like how this can be the one of their 20 bets, that's really going to take off, right? You can undersell yourself, right? You can come off as too practical,
Well, I can
right?
see
Nobody
why.
wants a point solution.
I can see why you probably thought that way originally, right? Because having been in the chair that you were in before, a lot of everyone says that they're the one-stop shop. They're the best
Right.
thing out there that
Exactly.
fixes all of it, right? And the natural inclination towards that is like, really, that's not the case. But that's what salespeople are going to sell, right? And flip it a little bit to the VCs. Yes, they want what's realistic, but they're also looking for what's my 100x,
Right.
right? So it makes sense for sure.
And like there's some really smart people in that community, right? And what I find among the best folks is that they're great at pattern recognition and pattern matching,
Hmm.
both with technology and people, right? Um, so I would say that was probably the biggest finding, where I was so practical because exactly for the reason you said, right? I've worked with a lot of like amazing companies, right? decacorn companies, um, and none of their products were life changing. Right? At the end of the day, it's people, process, and technology. And people is always number one, right? And so, but I'm only handling the technology portion, right? I'm trying to make people and process better. So you can tend to maybe undersell the potential of what you're doing when you think about it that way.
That makes perfect sense. So, where do you see this space, the vulnerability, kind of third-party software side, the securing it? Where do you see it in 3 years from now? I mean,
Yeah,
we probably don't even know. It's going to be
yeah.
looking
If I knew
wacky.
that, I would abandon this and just go
Yeah.
invest. But I
Thesis-wise, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, thesis. What I mean, overall thesis is the current, methodologies we use around CVEs to go as the quantifier of risk in software and what we build everything else off of. That's going to be broken. It'll be acknowledged. It may already be broken. I don't know, but it's going to be broken uh, such that it's a minority or at least an insufficient amount of software actually is covered by CVEs. So I think that will go away from being the primary, risk denominator for software, and people are going to look for other solutions. And again, I just look at where we are in the threat space and how we moved from static antivirus uh, to EDR and runtime solutions. I see right now with vulnerability management, we're still taking a static look. Everything you're getting around vulnerabilities, CVEs, the EPSS, and the exploitability prediction, I think that's like a very strong effort around it. It's all lagging indicators, uh, and it's none of it is probably sufficiently tailored to the environmental conditions present in like any organization's IT shop. Um, so folks are gonna, if you're gonna get lagging indicators, I want lagging indicators that are lagging by minutes, not lagging by days or months, right? So I think that'll just kind of go away and there'll just be a mindset shift. I'm not saying CVEs will go away, but the idea that no CVEs, it's secure, right? I I think we're gonna get away from there. Hopefully Spection's a big part of it, but I just don't see how we're not going to go with runtime data as a better view. And supply chain attacks, I think, are going to become more ubiquitous, right? I think every type of cyber attack typically starts very high-end nation states, right? Then methodologies and enabling tech that proliferates, makes its way down the cybercrime ecosystem in terms of sophistication and capitalization. I think the economics of supply chain attacks will get a lot better. And I think there will probably be supply chain attacks specific to AI generated software, whether it's via model poisoning or something else we can't yet predict.
We're starting to see the model poisoning be a thing from a lot of
Yep.
the people that I talk to. It's kind of something everyone's got their eyes on. So
Yep.
cool, man. Well, Joe, exciting times for you.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks.
I'm excited.
Thanks, Drew. Yeah. I mean, it's definitely not easy, but it's the best job I've ever done. Right. And I've had a lot of great jobs, work with a lot of great people. And I couldn't imagine myself doing anything else. And like I said, I think like there's a real opportunity. Listen, don't get me wrong, I'm a capitalist and I'm in this to make money. But I think there's a real opportunity, for inspection to do very well collaterally by solving a big problem. All right. Right now, I think software producers have a view of the security of their software. Software users have a totally different view. Right. I think, as we start to adopt more runtime view into software, both sides of the equation are going to start to even out. Um, and I think we're going to be better off for it overall.
Nice. That's what gets you up in the morning, man. It's good. You're solving big problems.
That and a pot of coffee. Yeah.
Fair enough. Thanks for coming on, bud. I appreciate it. Great conversation. Excited to see where Spection and you end up. And yeah, have a good one, everyone.